Good morning. Today we're going to look at Mark 16. That was yesterday's reading. And then tomorrow we will pick up today's reading. That would be the beginning of Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 20, and then tomorrow's reading. But in Mark 16 is the good news. Christ is risen. And it begins with, now when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices. And they came early in the morning when the sun had risen. And that's spelled S-U-N. And I have that underlined in my Bible and written in there also S-O-N. The sun had risen. The Son of God had risen just as the sun in the sky had risen. But their worry was, who was going to roll the stone away? And they got there and they found their worry, their fear had been taken care of. The stone was rolled away. The tomb was open. And I'm sure that they were quite surprised by that. And they went in and they saw this young man clothed in a long white robe. And he said, don't be alarmed. You look for Jesus? He's risen, just as he said. It was one of those unbelievable things, that, Jesus had told his disciples. And the women were, I'm sure, aware of this too, what Jesus had said, that, he had risen. And this young man, this angel that was there says, see where they laid him. And I'll go and tell his disciples and Peter. And so here, Mark's gospel is saying to the women, go and tell. Whereas back in chapter 8, there were 2 verses that Jesus specifically said to people, don't tell. But now it is the time to tell. It is the time to shout with joy and rejoice and sing hallelujah, Christ is risen. And he says, go and tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee, and they will see him there. And Mark 8 says, and they went out trembling with fear and were amazed and said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And some early manuscripts of Mark end there. And there are 2 different endings. And the one ending I have in one Bible, not in another one. The short ending of Mark reads as this. And all that they had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterward, Jesus himself sent them out from east to west with the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. That's the short ending of Mark 16. But the longer version is verses 9 through 20, where, it says, Mary Magdalene saw Jesus, she's the one he had casted 7 demons out of, Mark tells us. And then it says that she went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. And, we know that. We know how that happens. Just because we have a celebration of life and a funeral for someone on Friday doesn't mean that Sunday morning we're filled with joy and happiness. No, we're still weeping and crying and filled with mourning. And so the disciples, this is what they were. They were gathered together, but they were still in this deep shock and mourning of Jesus' death. And they had no reason to believe or to expect that what Jesus had said would happen, that he would be raised from the dead. And verse 11 says, and when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. And then, the next verse, Jesus then appeared in another form to 2 of them as they walked in the country. And this is the story of the 2 men on the road to Emmaus, that we don't find the whole story here in Mark's gospel, but in Luke. And it says that these, that he appeared to 2 of them as they walked and went into the country, and these 2 went and told it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. So the 11 disciples that remained had been told by Mary Magdalene, and also by these 2 disciples that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and these, so two eyewitness accounts come, and the disciples don't believe. And then verse 14, Jesus appears to the 11 as they sat at the table. And this would be, in the upper room as they are hiding, for fear of the Jews behind locked doors, as we read in other Gospels. And he says that the 11 were sitting at the table, and Jesus rebuked their unbelief and their hardness of heart, because they did not believe those whom he had sent. And then Jesus says to them, go into, this is the Great Commission, and we have it a little bit different form in Matthew. We read that, a month or so ago in Matthew 28. But he says, these are Jesus' words. He said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. That verse is very similar to John 3:18, where Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus, and he says, after 3:16, we know that verse, and 3:17, where he says, indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world will be saved through him. And then, Jesus says, but he who believes will not be condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already. Very similar words to what Mark has recorded here. And so Jesus is telling them to go and to spread the news and to believe everything that he had taught them, and that their task. He's sending them out to teach. And then he confirms, in this Great Commission, he's telling us the work of the church, to go and to preach the gospel. And then he says, in my name they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will take up the serpent. And if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover. Well, we know of most of those things that Jesus said are recorded as happening in the book of Acts, where except the one of drinking something poisonous. We don't find anything of that sort in Acts or any of the other New Testament readings, but they did. They cast out demons. They laid their hands on them. I think of Peter and Saul, Paul, as they were doing their ministry, and people's lives that were changed by them. And so we look at this ending of the Gospel of Mark with the good news of Jesus' resurrection and the work of the church laid out by Jesus, to go into all the world and to teach. And so we have a couple things I think we can think about with this gospel. The women came, early in the morning expecting to find Jesus' body in the tomb and wondering about, as I said, how to roll the stone away. But, that greatest fear of theirs had been taken care of. So often in our lives too, we fuss and fret and we worry ourselves about things that, maybe we don't have any control over. And we find so often that, when it comes to the point in time of getting to where, there isn't the biggest worry that we found out. And we need to remember just, to trust in God and for so many things that way. So God takes away, he provides an answer for our worries and our cares. And then another thing to think about is that, the women came expecting to find Jesus' body there. So where do we expect to find Jesus? And are we surprised sometimes at the places we do find Jesus? And we go to church and we expect to find Jesus there, but where might we see Jesus that we're not expecting? Or where might we expect to see Jesus and find ourselves surprised that we don't witness that, So the biggest thing, I think, to think about with the resurrection is that what does it really mean to you in your life that Jesus was raised from the dead by the power of God, and that Jesus tells us that it's, he says it, for those who believe, you are not condemned, you are saved. For those who believe. And so for those of us who believe, I mean, it's great news. But for those who don't believe, they're condemned already because they don't believe. So that gives us a task, the Great Commission of going and telling and spreading and encouraging others. And it's just as the 11 disciples at first, they didn't believe Mary Magdalene. They didn't believe the 2 disciples that had been on the road to Emmaus. And we know the one's name is Cleopas from Luke's gospel. They didn't believe some eyewitnesses. They didn't believe until they saw Jesus themselves when he came to that upper room. I don't know that very many people will have an encounter with Jesus himself, but they can encounter Jesus in you and me. And that's our task. That's what God would have us do, to spread the gospel in how we live, how we speak, and how we welcome others. May God richly bless you this day and always.